Hello everyone and welcome to PC Retro Tech. This week's video is really a continuation of last week's video on the Compaq Deskpro 386S that I've been fixing up. But I had so much additional material left over that I just decided to make a second video. So if you haven't seen that, there's a link above, but what I did is I cleaned the machine, I put a hard drive bracket in that had been missing, I replaced a real-time clock, battery had died in that, and I upgraded the memory a little bit. And then I went through a hard drive that I found in another Compaq 386 that I got as a parts machine, and I had a look at the games and utilities that people were using on the 386S. Now I've done a couple of things since then. I've added zip drives to some of my machines so I can get files across easily, and I even put a Sound Blaster 16 card in this. A little bit more about that later. That's for games and demos. But the content this week is a little bit different. What I want to focus on is the performance of the machine and some benchmarking. So in particular, I want to know how much the 16-bit data bus holds the machine back, and I also want to know about the Compaq VGA implementation. This seems to be something bespoke that Compaq came up for this line of computers, and I want to know whether they were cheaping out or whether they'd actually put a lot of research and development into it and came up with something really special. You might remember that I mentioned that Compaq introduced their Deskpro 386 machine, that's the second one along in this lineup, in 1986. And they had to solve a number of technical problems to get there. For example, they even had to write their own Compaq Expanded Memory Manager, CEMM, which eventually became EMM386.sys, which was the standard in the industry. And they actually beat IBM by a full 7 months to producing the first mass-produced PC based on the 386. And this propelled Compaq to great fame. In fact, they became one of the most powerful computer manufacturers of the era. But 2 years later, they introduced two new machines, the Compaq 386S, which is the one on the left, that's our machine, and the one on the far right, which is the Deskpro 386/25. Now, the one on the right was an expensive beast. It was $7,999 when it was introduced. It was a 25 megahertz, a full 386, and it was a little bit faster than the previous 386/20, which you can see immediately to its left. And of course the original 386 was at 16 megahertz. But they don't really say very much about it other than it's up to 60% faster than other people's 386 machines, which is not saying very much. They weren't even comparing it with their own lineup. So this really underscores one of the big problems with the 386 machine, and that is that it priced a lot of people out of the marketplace. And so this is why the 386S, our machine on the left, was introduced by Compaq at the same time. That is that it's a much cheaper machine to produce. You can even see that it's a little bit smaller. And the main trick is that it's based on Intel's new 8386SX chip, which has a 16-bit data bus instead of 32. And this means that you can build the machine based around much cheaper 16-bit era technology rather than 32-bit. And so that meant that they could offer something that people could actually afford. By the way, one of the interesting things here is that online you'll find a lot of sources saying that the 386/25, the one on the right, was introduced in 1989. But this article is actually from PC Magazine in 1988, in September of that year. So it seems that these other sources are just incorrect. Now, of course, I'd love to have one of each of these machines and benchmark them for you today on the channel, but of course that would be far too expensive. Even the Compaq 386S's go for an absolute fortune on online auction websites. As I explained in my first video, I missed out on getting one of these because I vastly underestimated what it would go for. But what I can do for you is compare with other 386 motherboards of the era. You might remember that I purchased this beauty a couple of weeks ago in order to benchmark against the Compaq 386S. It's a full 386. You can tell by the chip markings, it just says 80386. But you can also tell by all of these RAM chips here, and there's so many of them really because of that 32-bit data path, and also because it has parity checking. This was probably from a server, I would say. But there are a couple of problems with this board. First of all, I was getting parity errors whenever I ran any benchmarking. And this is easy to fix, of course. I just find the relevant chip that's faulty and replace it, and that's not too difficult. They're also garden variety and quite cheap. But the more serious problem is there's only 2 megabytes of memory here, and in order to upgrade this particular motherboard you need a bespoke memory upgrade kit which plugs into these 2 8-bit ISA connectors here. Now obviously those are not available anymore, and the person who sold me this board didn't have one. So that's going to make it impossible to do any benchmarking, just simply because we don't have enough memory. By the way, I also had problems with the parallel port on this. I tried about 8 different parallel port boards and couldn't get any to work. And I think it's something to do with the BIOS here. But I hadn't noticed the seller had the parallel port that belongs with this board listed separately on their auction website. It was labelled as such, but I just missed it the first time around. So I've managed to get hold of that, and that fixes the parallel port issue. But it's not going to help us with benchmarking against the Compaq. So this board will be put away into storage for a later project. Instead, I purchased a second 80386, a full 80386 board that we can benchmark against. You'll see it in a moment, but you'll discover that I had some problems with the board and had to repair it before I could get it to work. So that brings us to where the last video left off. So the material that you'll see from now is the extra material that was left over after last week's video. So let's continue from where that left off. Now the next thing I want to do is some benchmarking against this 386 machine that I have. And I've already spotted a couple of problems here. So this keyboard connector is quite bent. I don't think that's going to be a major issue. But something that could be a serious issue is one of the pins is missing on the power connector here. So I'm going to try it without the pin being there. It may be a duplicate. And it might just work anyway, but if not, I'm going to have to unsolder this from the board and see whether I can connect another one. But other than that, it looks okay visually, so we'll soon see whether it works. It's all set up a bit precariously here. That middle pin is actually just a ground pin, I think, and there are 3 others, so I'm going to give it a go and see whether it powers on. And certainly nothing happened there. Well, I went ahead and did some basic troubleshooting here. I've taken everything off the board, including the memory, the CPU, the ROMs, all of the removable chips that are socketed. And I've just had a look at this connector here, and I put a wire in where the ground pin is missing, just to see if that was somehow related. It's not. In fact, the power supply doesn't spin the fan up if the second connector is connected. So this one with the missing pin isn't relevant at all. And so I've had a look at the capacitors that are along next to the power connector there, and I've just done a continuity test, and there appears to be a dead short across one of the capacitors. The best guess I have at the moment is that the capacitor itself is faulty, so I'm going to take that out and see whether the board springs to life, and if that fixes it, then maybe we get somewhere with it. Well, I believe I found the problem. I went over the entire board and checked all of the capacitors, and I found that 4 of them had a dead short. So this one, this one, this one, and the one that I'd already desoldered on the rail. And I just went through them one at a time and removed one leg of each capacitor until I found that this one was the culprit. So now that I've taken that out of the circuit, the power supply starts up, and obviously there's no short across the supply. So I'm going to go ahead and put all the chips back in, if I can remember which way they go, and we'll see if that makes a difference. Now that capacitor is not really necessary for anything, it's just there for one of these two ISA rails, but that's no problem. We'll just use the other ones instead, and eventually that capacitor can be replaced if the board is in serviceable condition. Well, everything's plugged back in, and I've put the boards over on the right hand side this time so that they're away from that where that capacitor was, in the hopefully working ISA slots. So let's see what happens when we switch it on. Well, I certainly hear a hard drive powering up. That's a good start. Unfortunately, yep, I'm actually getting a picture on the monitor. Check this out, guys. Look at that. It's booting. Unbelievable. Wow, so it's just that capacitor that was dead, and apparently I didn't break anything else in the meantime, so that's great news. Alright, so we apparently have a board that's working. We'll see if it does the memory test okay. I think these are 1 meg modules, so there should be 4 megs there, and I have another 4 megs, hopefully, if it's arrived, and that should bring us up to 8 in this machine. I can't use 7, of course it needs sets of 4 modules in the board. You can see it's certainly very slow, but I'm assuming that's because turbo is off, as it was with the other board that we tried in the last video. And so far no problems with the memory count, so that's looking pretty good. Alright, so I'll try the other SIP modules and see if I can get the machine to actually boot up to DOS. Well, I put the other 4 SIP modules in, and it's counting past 4, so that's a good sign. It looks like we will have 8 megabytes to play with, which is great because that very closely matches what we have in the 386S. So that should allow us to do some good benchmarking, assuming that, of course, that I can get into the BIOS of this machine and set up the hard drive and so on. But so far, fingers crossed, everything seems to be working okay. Well, I had no problems at all booting into DOS. Just had to figure out how to get into the BIOS. The main issue there was just that there was a jumper setting correctly on the board for the Mathco processor, which isn't present. And so once I set that correctly, everything has been perfect. So I'm going to go onto my zip drive now and run a DOS bench, and this is going to allow me to test everything in terms of performance, and then we'll be able to compare with the Compaq 386S. The first benchmark I'm running is Superscape, and on the Compaq 386S we got a score of 5.2 in this. You can see it looks pretty slow here, so I'm not expecting it to be much different, and actually when the machine boots up it is in turbo mode, so I was wrong about needing to switch turbo on. It really just does count the RAM that slowly, unfortunately. So let's see what score we get here. I'm expecting it to be about the same. I've got a Parody 88 chipset in this, by the way, for the VGA card, and it should be comparable. Well, 4.4, okay, so a little bit slower. That's probably down to the machine itself rather than anything else, but at least we have a score. So the next thing I'll run is PC Player. Well, PC Player is also very much a slideshow, and we got a score of 1.0 on 386S, but this is a protected mode thing. It uses the DOS4GW protected mode layer, well, we get a score of 1.0 here as well, so unfortunately that's not telling us very much. It is faster compared with Superscape, but it's unfortunately not faster than the Compaq 386S itself. So let's try the Doom benchmark. Well, Doom does play, but it's very, very slow even in this minimum mode here, so unfortunately you wouldn't really want to use this. But we're mainly interested in the score, and in a moment it should give us some idea of how it's performed on this machine. Now, on the other machine, in 2,134 game ticks, it took 10,203 real ticks. So lower is better here, and actually it's just a little bit slower at 10,349 real ticks. So now I'm going to run Top Bench, which will do some real mode benchmarking. Now this is Top Bench, and I've gone ahead and added this to the database, this machine, and I'll just find the Compaq 386S, which we put into the database in the previous video. So that's already benchmarked, and then I've called this one 8386 full, and we can do a comparison here. So this one actually gets a lower score. You can see that the memory is a little bit slower on this machine, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The opcodes on the CPU are a little bit faster, which is a little bit of a surprise. I wouldn't expect there to be all that much difference there. It's not a huge amount, but the big standout thing here is the video memory speed. It's only got a Paradise 88 chipset, and I wouldn't mind betting that it's really just an 8-bit card pretending to be a 16-bit card. So I might change that over for something a little bit better and see if we can get a higher score there. But overall, this machine is actually, well, 13% slower than the Compaq 386S, which is really the opposite result than what you would expect. So the one thing that I can do to speed this up slightly is to change the wait states on the memory. So there is an option in the BIOS to do that, and I can set it to 0 wait states instead of 1. I don't know whether the machine will even boot in that setting yet, but we'll try it. The other thing is this board is overclockable. Yeah, even in the 8386 era, there is a setting on there to go from 16 megahertz to 20 megahertz. So that's a little bit more flexibility, I guess, than we have with the Compaq. But at any rate, let's give some of that a try and see if we can get a better score out of this, because at the moment it's doing exactly the opposite of what I would have expected for a machine with a full 32-bit data path. Well, the 0 wait states works, and it's totally stable and really makes a huge difference. So Top Bench says that it's 13% faster, but the other benchmarks are also much faster. So Superscape is now at exactly the same as what the Compaq 386S is, with a score of 5.2. So that's up from 4.4, which is a massive change. But interestingly, the PC Player benchmark is now really outperforming the Compaq 386S by 20%. So it gets a score of 1.2 now instead of 1.0. And that's exactly what we'd expect, because that is a protected mode benchmark. And similarly, Doom is now at 8489 real ticks versus 10,349 that we had before. So that's also up 15-20%. So 0 wait states is definitely a success. I'm going to now try the 20 megahertz option and see whether we can get even more out of this system before I switch over the video card. You can see that the video RAM speed, of course, hasn't changed because I'm still using the same card. Well, surprisingly, that actually worked. So it goes at 20 megahertz, and as you can see, it's now a whopping 33% faster than when we started. Obviously, still the video memory is the same. I didn't change this, but all of the other benchmarks are again just way ahead. So Superscape's up from 5.2 to 6.3 now, and PC Player went from 1.2 to 1.5, and Doom went from 8489 real ticks down to 6884. So that's a massive improvement. I'm actually quite impressed that this actually runs at 20 megahertz. So now I'm going to see what I can do about that video RAM, but I'm going to switch it back to 16 megahertz just so that we can do a more meaningful comparison with the Compaq 386S. Well, there it is in living color, guys. 0 wait states, a TsengLabs ET4000AX card, which is basically the fastest I know of in this system. Still has a video memory speed of 349, and the Compaq is still beating that at 292 microseconds. So the Compaq VGA implementation is really fantastic, it seems. So the other benchmarks didn't really change very much. It's up to 5.4 on Superscape. PC Player is still at 1.2, and Doom went down to 7852 real ticks, so a little bit of an improvement there. But this really goes to show that you can't really tell how fast something's going to be until you try it out. So obviously the Compaq 386S is really an amazing machine. Anyway, this video is very long, and I'm actually just finishing filming it very late at night here, wondering whether I should split this into two or whether I'll just keep it as one. I guess you'll know that when you start watching. But anyway, that's all I have time for this week. I really hope that you've enjoyed this. I've had an absolute ball. It's been fantastic going through all of this. So if you like this sort of content, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in a later video. Bye.